Call the meeting to order. Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening and welcome to the January 17th, 2023 Post Falls City Council meeting. Shannon, please note that all council members are present with the exceptions of Councilor Thorson and Shove, both of whom are excused tonight. We'll mention we do have 3 public hearings tonight. If anyone wishes to speak at any of the public hearings, there's forms on the podium in the back. Please fill them out, turn them into our Shannon, our clerk, and we'll let you talk. We do have an announcement. Post Falls Sanitation will be providing Christmas tree pickup for Post Falls residents on Saturday, January 28th. Trees must have all decorations removed and be cut into 4-foot bundles or less and placed curbside before 6 a.m. Again, that's on the 28th of January. And under appointments, Council, I am seeking your confirmation for the reappointment of James Hale to the Parks and Recreation Commission, Jayson Cornwell to the Parks and Recreation Commission, and the reappointment of James Steffensen to the Planning and Zoning Commission.
So moved.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion? Shannon, please take the roll.
Malloy.
Aye.
Ziegler.
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Are there any amendments to the agenda?
There are none tonight, sir.
Are there any declarations of conflict or ex parte contacts or site visits? Seeing none, would you please present the consent calendar?
Item A is minutes from the December 20th, 2022 City Council meeting. Item B is minutes from the January 3rd, 2023 City Council meeting. Item C is payables December 27th, 2022 through January 9th, 2023. Item D is October 2022 cash and investments. Item E is our ICREMP, that's our insurance provider, consent to electronic communications. Item F is approval of grant agreement with Kootenai County/Idaho Office of Emergency Management for the upgrade of security doors at the Post Falls Police Department. Item G is North Place East First Edition Subdivision Plat Application. Item H is fiscal year 2022 Road and Street Report. Item I is Foxtail 8th Edition Subdivision Plat Application. Item J is disposal of a document folding machine by the Finance Department. Folding is misspelled on that, Shannon.
Okay.
Item K is a bid award of 2 dump trucks to Freightliner Northwest. And then the final item L is purchase of a John Deere 210 P-tier tractor by the Streets Division.
Questions on the consent calendar?
Move for approval of the consent calendar as presented.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion? Roll call, please.
Ziegler.
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Now we're down to public hearings, and the first public hearing tonight is fiscal year 2023 budget amendment number 1. That opened the public hearing. Jayson.
All right. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Let's see. All right. In your council packet, I had given quite a substantial list of items that I wanted to amend the budget on. What I wanted to give a little brief history of, these are items we had in the prior year's budget that we didn't quite get to completing the project, or the item that was going to be purchased would be delayed until this year, and so we needed to carry that budget money forward. So creating a list of what departments needed what to be carried forward is about 15 million. And I'll go through those items to briefly explain what those items are for. The general fund, I'm looking at a 8.1 million. The substantial part of those are the transfer of frontage deposits to the street impact fee. What those are is we require developers to contribute some frontage deposit for a project, and when that project's completed, we use that money to complete it. So when the project is done, I needed to transfer that money from the general fund into the street impact fees where the project occurred. So I need a budget amendment on that. Also, a $6 million transfer to the facility building reserve. We have that in the general fund, and I needed to move that to the appropriate fund, so I'm going to move that on. Also, within the general fund, there is a few vehicles in here. The Freightliner single axle dump truck for the streets, for the fleet department of $317,258. Replacement tractor for parks maintenance, $26,870. The fleet shop lifts and installation of those for $103,371. Fleet and shop floor replacement project of $125,000. Let's go down the list for a Freightliner tandem axle dump truck for $375,414. A passenger SUV passenger vehicle for the fleet as well is $46,746. The salt for the public Post Falls Highway District in the city for $50,000. What that's going to be is the Post Falls Highway District will purchase from the city as needed, so the salt will be stored at the city. And also, there are $207,936 for Spokane and Prairie street improvements, so we'll transfer those monies over. And other funds for 037, that is the street impact fee. So projects within the street impact fees are the Chase Road, Burlington Northern Railroad Crossing, Spokane and Prairie improvements. And that is it for impact fees. Wastewater, wanted to go through those as well. There is $50,000 for the ITD new interchange and right of way. A SUV passenger vehicle for $23,373. The Bentley project in the wastewater capital fund, we need to carry those funds over $750,000. What else do we have in here that's fairly substantial for wastewater? And also the Vector truck purchase for $500,000 needs to be carried forward. Same goes for any water projects that are going on that we need to, as well as there is a $650,000 ITD interchange for right of way that the water capital fund is going to be purchasing as well. So these items are just items from the prior year carried forward to fiscal year 23.
Just for clarity, there's no new spending here.
No new spending.
It's all
Just
stuff.
prior year,
Correct.
yes. Yeah, we've tried to, in past years, we knew what we were going to need in upcoming budgets, so we've tried to rebudget it as we needed it. But with so many projects not being completed and so many items not being purchased, or there's such a lag time between purchasing a vehicle, we ordered it last year but won't be available for this year, so we need to bring that money forward. Yes.
Any questions? Thank you. Anyone wishing to testify? Shannon?
We have none.
With that, I'll close the public hearing. Council?
I would move to approve the fiscal year 2023 budget amendment number 1.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion? Roll call, please.
Ziegler.
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Thanks, Jason. Next public hearing is zoning approval criteria. With that, I'll open the public hearing.
Good evening, Mayor Jacobson and members of City Council. John Manley, Planning Manager, here to present the Title 18 housekeeping for the zone change criteria amendment. So the Planning Division is the applicant. What we're looking for here is to attain some clarity with the current zone change criteria and bring it in line with the state's LUPA Title 67. This was in the staff report Exhibit S2. This is kind of unfinished business to some degree. We brought this to you before on August 16th, and at that hearing you requested more information and a workshop to discuss this further, and that occurred on November. And a workshop to discuss this further, and that occurred on November 1st. So here is the current review criteria. Here's the first three. First one deals with being consistent with the future land use map. Second one deals with being consistent with the goals and policies found in the comprehensive plan. Both those two are in the comp plan. 3 and 4, those really all these are in the comp plan. So you're dealing with 3. You're looking at is any sort of proposal for zone change consistent with street classifications, traffic patterns, existing development, future land uses, community plans, or any other geographic natural features. The other one deals with commercial and high-density residential zoning and its location along streets with higher road classifications. The fifth one deals with neighborhood commercial and lower density and showing where it could typically be found along properties as they proceed further away from higher intense urban activity. And the sixth one is dealing with industrial zoning and its location. So the proposal is as you see here, in the first two, deals with, is the proposed zoning district consistent with the future land use map and focus area contained in the currently adopted comprehensive plan. So, and you look at the previous six, all these are addressed either in the future land use map or in the focus area or in goals and policies in the current comp plan. So really with the first two and the second one looking at the goals and policies for the same regard, all those are found in our, with the six. So the two do the same as the six, more or less. The third one is an add-on, and it's basically is what brings it into state code, and I'll fast forward here in a bit on that. And it's looking as the proposed zoning district, does it create a demonstrable adverse impact upon a delivery of services by any political subdivision providing public services within the city, including but not limited to the Post Falls School District. So I'll fast forward to the statute. Here's that 67, and highlighted are the areas in which the proposed amendment brings this in and being consistent with. And lastly here, that subsection C, is you start seeing that demonstrable adverse impact in the delivery of services by any political. So you see that language there in Title 67. This slide here looks at the comprehensive plan. So in that we have a future land use map and we have sub areas and these focus areas. And each one of those focus areas give guiding language. Like if you're on Prairie Avenue and you have a higher corridor, you're gonna put commercial and higher density near those areas. If you're gonna, potentially be further away, you'd have less intense. There's some language in some of them that talks about if vehicles are above 4,000 vehicle trips, then that would be suitable for commercial. So that kind of language that you see in Appendix A for these focus area provides guidance for decisions that are brought forward, similar to the 6 that we have. Looking at the other add-on that's currently not in our current language, deals with annexation. So deals with, in addition to the zone map amendment criteria stated above, the City Council will also consider the following criteria when the request on initial zonings upon annexation. Is the annexation of the property in the interest of the city? And it clears out that's a legislative decision. So this modification that you see here, we originally had 2. Now we have 3 with that one add-on. Came through those workshop and the discussed languages that we have. So there's the 6 there that we had before. I've kind of gone over what the proposal is with those 3 and with that one add-on dealing with annexations being a legislative. I'll go back to that. First I'll go to comments. So here's the comments we had. Postal Hydro District had no comment twice for both when it went before P&Z and when it was renoticed for council. DEQ, they had notified that there's notice that there was no environmental impacts to the proposal. And then the gas line, YPL, said they had no questions or comments pertaining to the proposed language. We'll cite one more thing before I go back to the proposal. When you're looking at Appendix B, the goals and policies, these are the chapters, not all of them, but this is the meat of the chapters. You deal with see housing, transportation, public services, parks, and open space, natural resources and hazards, economic development, and community design. The policies we have in Appendix B have policies that pertain to all those arenas. So that helps guide decision making when it goes to looking at a proposed zone change. Any questions for me on the proposed review criteria or potentially legal as well?
Any questions for John? Warren, as we discussed in the workshop, one of the reasons we do that, or we're looking at making this change, is to bring us more in conformity with state statute. Is that correct?
Correct. So our current standards were written they predated a code amendment that the legislature adopted. Let's try to find the date here really quick for you. So in, our current language has been around for some time. In about 2013, the legislature amended state law, and they adopted a standard that essentially says that the approval or denial of any application shall be based upon standards and criteria which shall be set forth in the comprehensive plan, the zoning ordinance, or other appropriate ordinance or regulation. Such standard shall be set forth in express terms, the idea being that way everybody knows what the rules of the game are. If you're the applicant, you know what you got to show to be able to get an approval. If you're someone who's interested, you know what you need to show to get an approval. If you're the council or staff, you know what you need to analyze in order to present it. So our current standards predated this change in language, and so what we've tried to do was put in express terms what the standards are. Our current standards are not written in an express way. There's actually a couple cases statewide that have touched on this since this came up. And the court's decisions so far have been that they need to be objective standards as much as possible, not just express, but objective to the extent you can get there. So we took a look at what the state code is regarding zoning amendments, and we tried to follow that language as closely as we could and sort of take out some of that the squishiness, if you will, and take out things where we've said previously, things like typically assigned, or those types of weasel words, lawyer words, that gives you wiggle room to do more things. And as John said, most of all of the things that you currently get on our 6 standards are still baked into that first 2 standards, because that information lives in our comprehensive plan. That's where that language comes from. So you can still get to the same place. You just look to a different place to find it.
Okay. Any other questions? Thanks, John. Shannon? Thank you. Wishing to testify neutral, Bob Flowers.
Bob Flowers. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Council. The reason I put down there neutral is if the change needs to happen, then great. I have a few questions that I'd love to have answered. One is, why now? And to what benefit are these changes to the people of Post Falls? What I'd like to see is more of a public workshop or information like what we do out there in the Rotunda area when we got new projects, and maybe have 1 or 2 meetings to actually have people out there from the city that can speak English and not a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo, because I'm sorry, our zoning regulations are some of the most complicated. I got everything I could on this to try to read it and understand exactly what's going on and why are we changing this and what's causing this change, and I really couldn't make heads or tails of it, to be honest with you. And I believe that something as important as zoning, especially here in the city of Post Falls, should be made clearer and put out to the public. In other words, just to have some folks there explain to the people why we need these changes, what brought on these changes, and just answer a few questions about Post Falls zoning. And I really would prefer, with no offense, Mr. Wilson, but I'd prefer people like John or Rob or some, people that that do understand our zoning rather than a legal opinion. That's all I got tonight.
Thanks, sir. Also wishing to speak in neutral, Mr. Burns. Howard Burns.
Good evening, Howard Burns, Post Falls. I sent a letter, I hope it's in all your packets. I liked the Hayden language because it brought the adjacent neighborhoods into the zoning criteria discussion. I think that's really important, that the neighborhood characteristics adjacent to any property have a great deal of bearing on whether a zone change is made or zoning of the type of zoning granted. I think that the citizens deserve to have that in the language. I also, in my letter, I mentioned that the transitional stuff, and John had a map, it showed this big blue area, which isn't in the city yet, but if I'm on the zoning commission and it's transitional, there's no guidance for me as to what I can vote unless the issue is what's next door, what's already been approved, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you shouldn't have transitional zoning. You should say everything in that transitional zone, if you want to come in, here's the zoning. It should be a focus area. It should say what it's going to be so that everyone knows. And I also think that the school district, as I said in my letter, no zoning should go through. No annexation should happen unless the school district formally submits a response. They cannot get away with having no comment or just saying nothing. And I don't know how many meetings I've been to where the school district has not sent in a response. They've been given a letter, they always are, and they never respond. And they're going to be asking for a giant bond to try to build a high school. And they need to start talking about it in the zoning changes. They need to be here. They need to represent themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. John, that was all the public comment. Any rebuttal or?
So I might go in reverse. So in dealing with the transitional, I want to clarify that's a land use designation, that's not a zone. And in the comp plan, it does say, it shoehorns you into looking at the focus area. So in reality, the transitional zone is a focus area map. You go to the focus area and look for guidance. Then looking at why now, well, we've done a lot of ordinance changes. This is the one that came to fruition now at this time to change this criteria to clarify that. We've clarified different things tonight. You're going to see cottage homes. We also have other things we're working on in the future, potentially like the parking ordinance is on our radar to look at that and see how we can improve the parking ordinance a little bit in Title 18. And so we're always looking at different chapters to improve on our current code. In regards to the intent and direction of this code, staff did look at legal guidance, and I think Warren talked to you the guidance on LUPA as being the directive and the direction that formed this code was being consistent with state code. I believe that answers most of the concerns that was brought up.
Thanks, John. Any questions, John? Thank you. I'll close the public hearing. Council, it's up to you. Who'd like to start?
Well, for me, when this was first proposed way back in the summer, I was probably the loudest in my concern that, hey, this is going to take away the council's ability to make any kind of ruling on it using our own criteria, feelings on the project, facts on the project, everything else, that we'd be completely shoehorned into, if it doesn't meet exactly this, this, and this, then you have to approve it, sort of thing. So the workshop in November was extremely helpful in that there's plenty of language in the comprehensive plan that if somebody supports a project, they can find criteria in the comprehensive plan to back up that support. If somebody opposes a project for actual objective reasons, not just I don't like the developer, but actual real reasons, then there's likely language in the comprehensive plan that can be used to support that assessment as well. So I came away from the workshop feeling a lot better in that if something comes in front of us, we just have to rubber stamp it. I found that not to be the case. So that aside, it's important that decisions we do make have the least amount of opportunity to run afoul of state code. Because if we run afoul of state code, then we end up getting to spend our own tax money and everybody's tax money fighting those battles in court, which nobody wants to do. So it's a lot to do with documentation, with reasoning behind an approval or rejection, and that reasoning is in accordance with state code. So I think given the amount of volume of annexation, zoning, and everything else we've seen in the last few years, that probably this should have happened a couple of years ago if everybody had a crystal ball. So,
And the time.
And the time. And the other thing is that some of the criteria, no matter what kind of project we're looking at it, 2 or 3 of the criteria are going to be not applicable. So somebody ends up standing up here and reading an entire list of criteria just so we can turn around and say that doesn't apply here. So that's just kind of a waste of everybody's time. So I think it's a good update. The final proposed changes are a bit different than the original proposed changes, and that was based on the feedback of the council in the workshop. So I appreciate that those changes were made and added, and I think it's a good change to be made. It's probably past due.
Anyone else?
I would agree. I think we hashed it over quite well in the workshop. We've got some tools that were produced that help guide us, and I feel comfortable with it.
Nathan?
I agree. I think Councilman Wood summed it up quite nicely. I do like that the proposed criteria are much more concise. Instead of going through 6, it's all captured into 2, still giving us the kind of the margins to make our own decisions independently of not being shoehorned into something that just because it meets the criteria, it's an immediate approval. And of course, we've hashed that over with the workshop, but I feel confident in the changes that are proposed.
Josh?
I agree with everybody, knowing that it doesn't tie our hands and puts us in line with state code.
My biggest concern when we first started talking about it is, okay, so if it meets it, it has to be approved, and that's not the case. And so my concern was that it would prevent the council from, I guess, as Joe said, voting, based on certain information or being able to decline something because it meets X, Y, and Z, and that's not the case. The council still has the ability to make their decisions, and not everything will be, again, rubber stamped, and you've got the opportunity to vote no. So I like the changes that were made from the workshop, and I think it's nice to come in line with state code, because as I think Joe said, if you run afoul of it, we're spending taxpayer money. If we get sued, and that's never a good thing. I'd entertain a motion.
I would move to approve the zoning approval criteria file number TA-22-5.
Second?
Motion second.
That's fine. As you said, the next step would bring an ordinance back to you at the next meeting for final approval, so your motion is well taken.
Okay, and I will add to that. I move to approve the zoning approval criteria file number TA-22-5, directing the ordinance to be brought back at a future council meeting for approval.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion. Roll call, please.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Ziegler.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Third public hearing tonight is Title 18 Cottage Home Ordinances. That'll open the public hearing.
All right, good evening, Mayor Jacobson, council members. Laura Jones, Associate Planner with the City of Post Falls, introducing you to the Residential Home Performance Standards, case file TA-22-7. The City of Post Falls Planning Department is the applicant. The requested action is approval of the Cottage Home Residential Performance Standards, update to Title 18 definitions, and increase the medium density R2 residential single-family lot size. A little bit about how staff came to this point to develop cottage home performance standards. We realized that there is a missing middle housing that needs to be addressed in our city for affordable homes. So over about a year, staff looked at neighboring cities and other states for jurisdictions that had cottage home performance standards. And over that year, we've developed maybe a dozen iterations of the ordinance until we got to a point in October where we brought it before City Council in a public workshop. The following week, we took it to the Planning and Zoning for another public workshop. Then we sent out an email to 2 or 3 dozen developers in the community and got their feedback on the ordinance. After those events, we took all the comments we gathered, made a few revisions based on the forums and the workshops, and then had a planning and zoning hearing on the 13th of December. So planning and zoning did have a few recommended changes, and I'm going to go over them here and then I'll summarize at the end with those changes so you can kind of look for them throughout the presentation. First, they would like to amend the medium density R2 single family lot size. Staff proposed it going from 3,000 square feet, which it currently is, and increasing it to 4,800 square feet. Planning and zoning thought that 4,000 might be more appropriate. And just for reference, the single family R1 lot size is 6,500 square feet. For garages, we did originally have that all properties had to be rear loaded from an alley. That has changed with this ordinance draft. So with that, they asked that we clarify that garages, when we refer to garages, it's both front and side loaded garages that can't exceed 360 square feet in size. For porches, they want to clarify that it is a front porch, not a rear or a side. And also to emphasize that the garage setback is 20 feet, which is referenced in a different part of Title 18, but they would like us to make reference to that section of Title 18. And then lastly, to allow for rear and side yard fences to be 72 inches in height rather than 48, which is what we had currently proposed. So why does staff look to draft cottage home ordinance performance standards? It's to provide a form of single-family residential units and diversify housing choices and potentially expand home ownership opportunities, and to create a path to offer missing middle housing and single-family residences rather than there's only single-family or there's multifamily. There was kind of no in-between other than duplexes or twin homes. And then, as John just went over in his presentation, to be in compliance with LUPA and to seek ways to create low-cost conventional housing. So why have standards? Currently there are none. Having standards provides a level playing field for all cottage home developments and a clearer path in the permitting process. Cottage home housing developments may incentivize additional infill projects. We've actually had a couple people come forward looking to do infill and asking about cottage home developments as an option. Cottage housing can offer a smaller scale housing choice, which is suitable for meeting variety of needs compared to traditional housing of single family residential units. And then advantages of cottage homes is their flexibility for making more effective and desirable use of underutilized spaces. As an infill development, they can maintain a spacious feeling with open courts. And as a high density development, they offer privacy by having detached units. Their size allows them to be potentially more energy efficient than a typical single family home. And they can serve as housing for families seeking to downsize, young households, and the workforce. So moving forward with the presentation, everything that is underlined is a change that has been made since you were first introduced to this in October in the public workshop. So any detached residential structure, either on a platted lot or a common lot, with a total living area of less than 1,400 square feet, but larger than 800 square feet, is how we define a cottage home, and the ground floor can be no larger than 1,200 square feet. So those have increased. In the first iteration of the ordinance that you saw at the workshop, it was anything between 600 and 1,200 square feet, and the main floor couldn't be any greater than 1,000 square feet. So based on current trends and the developers thinking what suitable product was and marketable product for our community, they asked it to be increased. Cottage homes can be outright permitted in R2, R3, and RM zones. They would be allowed in the CCM zone where there's an approved development agreement. You will remember that all mixed zones have development agreements, so only where CCM allows for multifamily, is where you could put these cottage homes. In CCS and R1, they could be approved through a special use permit. R1 was added again because they have the look and feel of a single-family home and would fit with R1 zoning, just the smaller lot size. And they would not be allowed in industrial, heavy industrial, or technology mixed. All right, looking at general standards for cottage homes, these apply to both platted lot and common lot cottage home developments. As mentioned earlier, we originally had said they had to be accessed from the rear only. Since that changed, we had to change the garages that could be allowed with these types of developments. So front-loaded cannot exceed 360 square feet or 66% of the lot width if it is an attached structure. This is for not only street aesthetic and visual appeal of the property, but also for emergency services so they can actually locate the front door, see the front address, et cetera. For rear-loaded, since we don't have that issue, since the front door would be on the opposite side of the house, the garage can't exceed 500 square feet, so they would be allowed to have a little bit larger garage. Looking at porches, every single cottage home would be required to have a porch with a minimum depth of 6 feet. That's just to increase the outside usable space since they are smaller homes. Front-loaded, the porch can be no less than 50 square feet, and again, that's to accommodate potentially the attached garage with the width restriction and size limitation. And rear-loaded, it can have up to an 80 square foot porch. So these developments are not just cookie cutter and all houses look the same on little 30-foot wide lots. No two abutting or directly opposing cottage homes may have the same front facade and must alternate the application of items listed in 182432 C2E and have a minimum of 4 elements, features, or treatments listed in that same section. And that is a new code section. That is our title, or our cottage home performance standards. And those elements include things like dormers, bay windows, gables, stonework, and masonry, just to give a little bit of variation in the look to the neighborhood. In addition, accessory structures must match the architectural style of the cottage home and meet the building code separation requirements. Since again, these units are smaller in size, outdoor usable space is imperative. So every cottage home must provide 550 square feet of common green space per unit and provide a pet waste cleanup station. That was added through our comments from developers and public and staff. Developments with 8 or more units must have 50% of the common green space centrally located. Again, that's just to have a functional space big enough that kids can kick a soccer ball around. You can have a family picnic out there. 20% of that green space must be fronting a street. That's for safety, so people driving by have visual access to that green space, make sure it's open and just street, just for, again, safety, and so people can see what's happening in there. That was reduced from 25% to 20%. That was based on our developers' feedback, just crunching the numbers. It was hard for them to meet that 25%, so 20% seemed to be like a workable number from our feedback. Developments with 8 units or less must consolidate the common green space into one location, again, just so it's functional, with no dimension less than 20 feet. Cottage homes placed on individual lots will only require 325 square feet of common green space. This is so we don't kind of double dip the green space, and they have to meet their building setbacks anyways, so we don't want to have that building setback plus the 550 square feet. So we've reduced it there. However, they do have to provide a functional yard located in the rear side that equates to at least 10% of the parcel area and no dimension less than 15 feet. So in this diagram, you can see we've got the front setback, and the side yard here is not functional. It's more of just a pathway. And so in the back, they could have this dimension of no less than 15 feet, 10% of the parcel area, and it is functional. They can have their fire pit, their picnic table, whatever back there. They can sit as a family and have dinner and have a little bit of privacy. And if lots are less than 3,500 square feet in size, that dimension can be reduced to 12 feet in size. Again, crunching the numbers there, we couldn't get 15 to work, but 12 on the smallest lot size that we allow seemed to work with the setbacks and the building size. Fences are going to be prohibited in green spaces, common green spaces. There are exceptions such as dog parks, dog parks, tennis courts, swimming pools, things that typically do have fences around them. Looking at parking, we made a revision to the last ordinance draft. We had 1 off-street parking stall per unit. We've increased that to 2 based on your feedback and feedback from the commissioners. Developments of 8 units or more for each cottage home that fronts a green space or a street where parking is not allowed will have to provide an additional 0.25 parking stalls per unit within a common cluster. So instead of providing a large surface parking lot for the cottage home development community, we'd like to see a parking cluster, centrally located, one on the east side, one on the west side. That way people aren't having to lug groceries, too far from the unit they're going to, or if it's a guest on Christmas, they don't have to take their casserole, 2 blocks, 3 blocks away. They can be closer to the unit. All right, looking at access, again, mentioning that we've changed it that they do not have to be necessarily rear loaded on all of them. Vehicular access should be accessed from rear or side. However, when design constraints prove implausible, the zoning administrator may grant a deviation of up to 50% of the lots being front-loaded. And cottage homes are encouraged to front green space and must have a pedestrian path constructed of concrete or asphalt between the sidewalk and the building entry. This picture here is a good example. You can see here they are all rear-loaded, and they've got the concrete path going to every single building entry. And that is a requirement from our fire district so that they can get the gurneys to the front door. All right, so looking at the cottage home performance standards, this is for the individual lots, not necessarily the platted lots. So the minimum lot size is 2,400 square feet with a front setback of 16 feet to the principal plane. You'll recall that we require a 6-foot deep porch on every single structure. So that would put the porch right at 10 feet from the property line, which pretty much every street in our city has a 10-foot sidewalk drainage and utility easement. So it puts the porch of the home as close to the property line as it can be without encroaching into the easement. The side setback would have a net of 12 feet with no less than 3 feet on either side. That was reduced from 15 feet in our previous ordinance draft. And just to touch base on this really quick, building code separation requirements is 6 feet without fire rating, and that's for the portion of the building that has the closest projection. So not necessarily foundations on most homes, but the eaves would have to be 6 feet apart. So the houses could be 3 and 3 at the foundation, which is what planning measures for setbacks, but the eaves would have to be fire rated or they'd have to push the buildings further apart. For the rear setback, it depends if it's going to be front-loaded or rear-loaded for the driveway. Front-loaded would require 12-foot setback and rear 20-foot setback. Flanking street, 10 feet. Again, we have that 10-foot sidewalk drainage and utility easement, so it would be just outside of that. And based on feedback, we have increased the height from 25 feet to 30 feet. Oops. Looking at accessory structures, they cannot exceed the height of the primary, and they cannot exceed the area of the primary or 720 square feet, whichever is less. Fences, staff has drafted that the front height, the height of the front yard fence cannot exceed 36 inches. That is our standard code for all residential units currently. And again, it's so emergency services can see addresses, they can see front doors. Currently, staff has drafted that the side and yard setbacks cannot exceed 48 inches, but that first revision slide from planning and zoning, they would like to increase that to 72 inches in height. Green infrastructure is not a requirement, however, it is an incentive so that developers can look to the future for when we have more electric vehicles and things on the road, or if we ever get into a situation where there's water restrictions. So where a minimum of 25% of the lots contain green infrastructure amenities, common green space requirements can be reduced by 50 square feet per unit. And some of those amenities could be EV chargers, green roofs, solar arrays. All right, looking at multifamily cottage homes, these only apply to common lot cottage home developments. Again, they have to be rear loaded unless with this one they go through a special use permit. And again, they have to have a path connecting the front door to the sidewalk. Building separation, again, it must meet the adopted building code without without additional fire rating. And then setbacks would only apply to the structures adjacent to the property lines, so 20 feet for the front, 10 for the side and rear, and 20 for the flanking street. And again, we've increased the height here from 25 feet to 30 feet. And so the multifamily cottage home standards, it is 3 or more units on a single lot. So you can think of it as the detached version of a 3-story walk-up. Again, there's green infrastructure amenities that they can use to reduce their open space requirement by 50 square feet per unit. They would have to provide at least 2 amenities listed in Title 18-2430, which is the same as our current multifamily standards. We require them to provide 2 amenities. Those include things like dog parks, walking trails, community gardens. EV stations would work, 1 per 25, which many of the apartments that do offer EV charging stations right now, 2 that come to mind are Remington and North Crown. It's typically about 1 charging station per building, so that's where we got the 1 per 25. Looking at access, driveways, parking, and garages, for multifamily, staff would consider consolidated parking structures, so just the large carports that can accommodate 10 or 20 vehicles. Outside storage and solid waste would have to be screened and meet our requirements of Title 18 that we currently have for multifamily. This is a application that was brought forward in 2020 for Tullamore Vista. I use this as an example during our public workshop. This does not quite meet our current cottage home standards because these lots are larger, but the idea is here where you have green space here and here that is centrally located. The lots are alley loaded or rear loaded, and then they have a walking path connecting the front doors to the sidewalks. So this was a 20-acre site, and that central area would potentially work for a cottage home development. Another hypothetical infill lot is on Spokane Street and 16th. This is about a ½ acre, and you can see when you superimpose the image I used from earlier in the slide that it basically works out that you could get about 7 units on this ½ acre lot. And that is pretty, it's not exact, but it is a pretty accurate depiction of how an infill lot could work. This is a list of the agencies that were routed for review and given a chance to comment. We got comments back from Yellowstone Pipeline with no comments. Department of Environmental Quality had no environmental impacts. Post Falls Highway District had no comment, and the school district was neutral. And again, I've got the list of proposed changes here from the Planning and Zoning Commission. And with that, I can stand for any questions.
Any questions of Laura? I think the one that I had, and you addressed it with the increased fire rating, and that was on the 12-foot setback, or total. And if they were 3 and 3,
Yep.
that would work. However, they would have to have increased fire rating.
They could, or yes, they would require increased fire rating. And that is something that would be addressed at the building permit phase. And so whoever builds first, if they do a 3-foot setback, the next person adjacent to them that builds second would either have to fire rate or do a greater setback. But the idea there of the net of 12 is that you don't get a uniform 5-foot, 5-foot, 5-foot. You can get some variation in the side yards.
Questions of Laura?
I'm just concerned about fire rating between those buildings when we put them that close together. And if you're talking 30 foot in height, you know, we've got the potential for the same issue that we've had in town for the last couple of years. I'm just uncomfortable with that. I think that we ought to have, if we're gonna have it in an ordinance, we ought to have a requirement for fire rating between structures. That's my personal.
Because of the 12 feet?
Yeah, I just think that's too close. I see it right up off Idaho Street on the fires that we've had up there. One house burns, the next one is too close. I just don't know why we can't say we're gonna have fire rating period when we're talking this type of housing where everything is so close. That's.
Okay. Other comments?
That is something we talked about in the workshop of either having a mandatory fire rating or alternating the minimum setback where you wouldn't have 3 and 3 adjacent. Which I think it is a concern for me as well, which is why we talked about it. So on the flip side of that, I also advocate for trusting our informed authorities on fire rating and what it takes to control that. So, you know, there is a little bit of a balance there. But I do like the increase in dedicated parking spaces off-street to 2 per unit. That was something that we also talked about. That's a good change. But that would be in the forefront of my mind is the setback, adjacent lot setbacks.
Let me interrupt, Brooker. I'm sorry. Warren, are we okay with this discussion, or should we go to public comment before we get
So
this discussion?
before you get too far, you do have a couple of folks I
Okay.
think that want to testify,
Okay.
but
Sorry,
before we get
no problem.
into
We'll come
debate
back
at
to you.
least.
Yep. Any other comments of Laura before we get into a discussion like this? No? Thanks, Laura. Shannon? Should have.
Yeah, move it out of sequence.
Yeah. Wishing to speak in favor, Ryan Martin?
Not wishing to speak, but I could.
I'm sorry. Do you wish to speak? No, I misread that. My apologies. Ryan says, I'm all for cottage homes, a good way to use small spaces. In favor, and it doesn't say if they want to speak or not, Trevor Gall? Do you wish to speak? If you do, ma'am, please, you have to come up and give your name so we can get you recorded. And I can read your comment too, so whatever you want.
Hi there, I'm Treva Gall, and I just see so many apartments, and I know everybody doesn't want to live in an apartment building and they can't afford a lot of the homes that have been built, and I just see it as much more aesthetic and more family-oriented. I work with a lot of older individuals, and they have 3,000 square foot homes, and they're living at home alone, and it's way too much for them, and they could downsize into something like this and still stay at home and take care of themselves and take care of their home and have more of an income to live on from selling their home. So I see it as a very positive thing. I'm from Montana where there's a lot of space, so it wasn't my idea, but I think it's a great one.
Okay, thanks, Trevor. Wishing to speak in favor of Nolan Gall?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Just give us your name for the record, please.
What's that?
Name for the record.
Okay,
please.
Nolan Gall,
Thank you,
Post
Nolan.
Falls. Thank you for the opportunity. With the cottage homes, I see the opportunity. I've got 3 kids that rent, and I see the opportunity for families that are just starting to be able to actually afford. When I first came to Post Falls, it was $115,000 for a decent sized house, and people could actually afford that. Today, you're not even in the market locally. So I see an advantage of being able to take and build a quality home, and the pride of ownership. I can remember getting my first home and owning it. That's been a while, but I believe that the ownership of a home stabilizes the community, gives people something to lose when they're actually a part of it. I've lived in trailer parks and mobile homes a lot of my life, and there's just the commitment of the people. You have a junkie community, and I believe that this would be a way to really improve the property, really give people a say in their life, and to give them something to actually feel like they're a part of the community. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. And wishing to testify, wishing to speak neutral, Howard Burns.
Howard Burns, Post Falls resident. This slide that's up has one of my questions in it. I'm confused. That says lot area minimum 2,400 square feet, but there was an original ordinance said 4,800 foot minimum lot size, with the Planning Commission suggesting bringing it down to 4,000. So maybe someone could come up after this and explain the difference between the lot area of 2,400 feet and 4,000 or 4,800 feet. Then beyond that, here are my other questions. If I have this zoning, can I apply for a PUD overlay? I hope not. I think that should be restricted. It can't happen. Visitor parking, I'm glad to see that some's allotted. I think you need to look at how close they make the driveways, because in some of even the R1 neighborhoods up where Viking is building, they have cul-de-sacs, and there's no way anybody can park on the street. The spaces between the driveways and that PUD are too short for a car. What happens if I buy this house and it's 1,200 square feet and I come into the planning department and I want to add 500 feet? Is there an ordinance that says I can't do that? My house should not be able to exceed the 1,400 feet if I add on to it. If I have the 800 square foot, I can add on to get it to 1,400, but I shouldn't be able to keep adding on and make it giant. I think there should never be adjacent to a standard lot size R1 property. It should never be backed up to it without a public hearing, because if I live in an R1 house in my backyard, I expect somebody else's backyard is going to back up to it when something's built. I don't anticipate it to be an alley. So I think that needs to have a hearing. If it's going up against without a street, the R1 people need to know that. I think an HOA should be required for anything over a certain number. Maybe it's 8, but somebody needs to work at getting the snow off that side street. It should be a requirement. The green space that's required. Are detention basins counted as green space? A big dip that takes all the excess water, does that get counted as green space? Because it shouldn't. That's not usable space. Yeah, it's green because it's mildewed, but that's about it. And last but not least, on the little map that showed the building area, I didn't see where the driveway showed up. It showed the buildable lot line, and then it showed the little green yards at each end, but it didn't show the driveway. So I was confused by that. Thanks.
Thank you. Laura, would you like to come up and address it?
Sure, I'll address a few things here. First of all, to answer Mr. Burns' question about the 4,800 versus 4,000 versus 2,400. So those are two different amendments to Title 18 that we're looking at. So 2,400 square feet is the lot size for the cottage home lot. The 4,800 is what was proposed for the single-family R2 lot size to be changed to. And then planning and zoning is hoping to have it reduced back down to 4,000 instead of the proposed 4,800. So 4,000 for R2, 2,400 for cottage home standard. Hopefully that clarifies.
I got a question on that. So
Yeah.
if you got cottage homes, the minimum of 2,400 square feet lots, you couldn't put that in R2, but you could put it in R3, for example.
You could put it in R2 as a cottage home. So we won't have a bulk emplacement chart like we do, to my knowledge at least. Maybe that's a question for Warren. But if they go to subdivide and they're in the R2 zone, they can do 2,400 square foot lots, but it's basically restricted to cottage home. They couldn't put a single family house there. It's a cottage at that point.
Okay,
Does that answer you, Joe?
yeah.
Okay. Moving on to notifying neighbors of a new cottage home development going in. Every property owner within 300 feet of a property being subdivided gets a written notice in the mail. So that should address that if they are adjacent. An HOA is required with subdivisions, and so that could outline how the streets will be, how the width of the streets. Engineering will look at with the subdivision before it's even allowed to move forward to plat. They'll also look at if the width can accommodate parking on both sides, one side, or if no parking signs should be allowed. We do have a standard in our code right now that driveways cannot exceed 40% of the lot width. John, am I missing any other things that?
And if you were an R1 next to another R1, you saw that you would need a special use permit, which is a public hearing, so you would see that. You could potentially, in a site plan, if an R1 was adjacent to an R2 and an R3, which already has some entitlements for increased densification on it, you would be able to come through theoretically through a cottage home development on an R2 and R3 adjacent to an R1 similar that you can now.
But that's if it's already zoned R2 or 3.
Right, other than doing a zone change, which once again, we know that you have two public hearings and a zone change going before P&Z and council. So either like what Laura mentioned through the subdivision process or through a special use permit in the R1, there would be some notification.
Thank you.
I'll add one more thing that if this is a multiple units on a single lot, so a multi-home cottage development, we do require a landscape buffer if it's next to R1 because it would be considered more like a multifamily than a single family. So we do have landscape buffer requirements for that.
Okay.
Just one quick
Joe,
thing.
go ahead.
I think a commenter missed your comments on the HOA. Can you go over that one more time real quick?
So an HOA is required with a subdivision. It is part of the packet that we receive and we review before we approve the plat to come forward to council.
Thank you.
Questions of Laura? Thank you. Close the public hearing. Council, Nathan, do you have anything else to say?
Well, two things at the top of my list. Number one, it makes sense to just have a criteria in place since we don't have one now. We have something to go on if a developer comes with a project for us. And I do like the idea of cottage homes for having an entry-level option for either older or younger families to get into the market. I do think that home ownership creates a pride in the community, and it also, you're building equity, so you have the opportunity to then to advance in your, if you choose to move on to a bigger house. So I'm for this.
Okay. Josh, any comments?
I like it. Given the opportunity for people to buy a home that's smaller, given I have a lot of kids and I know they're gonna have a hard time as they come to age to try to move out around here with the way things are, so. And the opportunity for people to be able to buy is great, so.
Bill?
It's one thought that kind of struck me as funny is that you look at some of these criteria, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago when these wouldn't be referred to as cottage homes, but just homes. My first house, 1,100 square feet on a small lot, and I never would have thought that was a cottage, but yeah, I think appropriately placed, these are great for infill. It presents a really good opportunity to have some standalone product that isn't all duplexes, fourplexes, apartments. The density requirements for R2 will keep it from getting too packed in R2. R3 is probably still going to lean towards multifamily just for maximization of the property, but has been iterated and reiterated the ability for people to own something at a more reasonable cost. I've said this several times before. If I was to move here now and buy the house I'm in, I couldn't do it. There's just no way. I wouldn't be able to live here. So, it's good to have some opportunities that are aesthetically pleasing, provide some privacy, and give people the opportunity to build some equity while minimizing the impact on the surrounding neighborhoods. So I like it.
I like the change to go to if council does, to go to a 6-foot fence on the sides. I like that for the privacy side. You know, your smaller lots, and even if you have a bit of a yard, it's not gonna be, there's not a whole lot you can do in the small yard. That's why I like the common space, the green, open green space. I think that's very helpful. Again, I would agree with what's been said. I think it's another alternative. And there are folks that don't want the big houses, you know, both old and young alike. So I think this is a option. Go ahead.
Just one more thing I thought of, because it was brought up in the public comments in terms of green space. Can it just be a swale? The answer is no. We went over this in our workshop. That's why the word usable green space is in there. So if it's just a hole in the ground with a drain pipe sticking up, that's not usable green space. So it does have to be something that at least people can kick a ball on or lay out a blanket or something like that. So,
Lynn, anything else?
No, I'm good. I like the standards. I like the idea. The only thing I don't like is the separation issue.
With that, I'd entertain a motion.
Quick question about that. Do we need to stipulate if we're going to approve the recommendations of the changes that planning and
PNZ.
zoning?
That would be helpful. That way we know what to draft and bring back to you.
Yeah.
I would move to approve the Title 18 Cottage Homes Ordinance File Number TA-22-7 to include the recommendations made by P&Z. And am I directing staff to bring back anything, or is this it?
Bring back an ordinance.
And to direct staff to bring back an ordinance at a future council meeting.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion. Shannon, please take the roll.
Walker,
Aye.
Malloy,
Aye.
Ziegler,
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
The motion passes. Thank you. Thanks, Laura. Next item up is unfinished business returning ordinances, and the first is the water tower parking lot and pocket park approval to bid parking lot and approval of pocket park concept. Boy, that's a lot of
That's a lot of
pockets.
alliteration
It
right
is
there.
a lot of pocket park to talk about.
Pocket park.
Mayor and council, this will be a joint presentation by myself and Robbie Quinn. I will go over the water tower parking lot. We'll be requesting permission to go to bid with that. Robbie will cover the pocket park and the status of that, the concept that we had with that. So, kind of briefly, early last year, in February, council approved the contract with Welch Comer Engineers to complete a design and bid package for the water tower parking lot, and also to create a concept design for the water tower pocket park. We wanted a concept for the water tower pocket park, so we knew that those two would be integrated when they're eventually built, and we wanted the grades to be able to match, so they were ADA accessible from one to the other. So that was the approval that was provided, and why we combined the concept of the pocket park with that. Project location, the city acquired this parcel from Liberty specifically to provide a parking lot down there for the community. We have a city center parking plan. We had some dollars that were allocated through general fund to help increase parking in the downtown area. We found that we got a greater yield out of an individual parking lot than we would get from necessarily street frontage, predominantly because we've got a lot of the streets that are in transition, and we still have driveway approaches and things like that. So general location is north-south on Spokane Street, and then the east-west is McReynolds Drive. The water tower, thank you, Robbie. Water tower parking lot design, very similar to the design that we presented when we initially came to you for dollars. We got a very similar yield to it as well. Off of McReynolds Drive, we have a one-way in, circles around, and a one-way out. The elements of the design. We have 39 parking stalls, of which 2 of those are motorcycle and 2 are handicap. So we're able to incorporate some motorcycle elements within there. There is street lighting in the basic design, stormwater landscaping. We're also installing conduit in there in case in the future we want to put in some electronic vehicle charging stations. We don't want to have to come back and tear up the parking lot or tear up things for that. And we're seeing that is a trend with a lot of the newer parking lots that are established. We're providing additive alternates to the project, so we'll have a base bid and some additive alternates. Those additive alternates include some bike racks, 4 bike racks, some benches, and a trash receptacle and some other things we have kind of located at the corner of Spokane Street and McReynolds through there. For the parking lot, the bidding status and process, staff has and legal have reviewed the contract documents. We believe they're ready to proceed. The base bid and the additive alternates I spoke about briefly. We can award with a base bid and any selective additive alternates, all or none, if we were to choose. And the construction time frame on this. So we're going to give the contractor some flexibility in a construction time frame. We think that what we saw last year, this will really help us with the bid allocations with that and bid pricing. We're going to give the contractor 175 working days to complete the project, during which at 175 days they've got flexibility of 35 consecutive working days to come in and complete the project. So they can fit it in between their other projects. And we think that'll help make this project a lot more competitively bid and a lot more attractive to the contractors that are out there with that. So at this point, I will turn this over to Robbie, and the action items will come towards the end of the project. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Bill. Good evening, Mayor, members of council, Robbie Quinn, Parks Planner. And as Bill mentioned, when this project came about, there was funding to build the parking lot, but not necessarily to build the pocket park. However, we did want to ensure future compatibility of the two, so that's kind of why we moved the concept design along with the parking lot design, as you mentioned, to kind of make sure grades work, and at a future date we did actually be able to build a pocket park that would work with the parking lot. So there were a couple options that were presented to the Park and Rec Commission, and this was the one that they recommended be brought forward to council for adoption. And so it's kind of, this was designed by BWA, which was a sub-consultant to Welch-Comer. And so we call this kind of a radial design, where they kind of took the center here is the water tower. So they kind of took that shape and, and superimposed it on the ground plane, to where below that they designed a plaza space with informal, picnic tables could be out there. And then from there, different access points to, the parking lot as well as the sidewalk on both ends along Spokane Street for different access. And again, all those would meet ADA requirements for grades. And then taking kind of advantage, there's a little bit of topography on the site, so they designed in some small, amphitheater type steps where people could go out there and just sit and relax and kind of enjoy the views. So this would be looking out towards the river here. And then it is a small space, so there wasn't necessarily room for playground equipment of that nature, but they put in some options for, some large boulders that kids could potentially, jump around on top of. And then along the parking lot, put in some sort of trellis screening feature to kind of block the parking lot from the pocket park itself. And so that was kind of the basis of the design. And then during the process, they kind of had a pretty unique idea about putting in an observation deck. And so that's the turquoise square you see here. And so what they thought was, could we, have access to a portion of the water tower to really take advantage of the views of the river and kind of the downtown area. And obviously at this point, we don't know if that's feasible at all, whether the structure could take it or if it would be financially feasible, but it was just kind of an idea that they threw out. And staff brought it forward to Park and Rec, and they agreed that it was a pretty cool idea, and again, brought that forward here for you today. But like I said, we don't have funding to build the park at this point, or the observation deck for that matter, and that would require a structural analysis of the water tower, which would be done at a future point when we had more funding to actually build this project. So all we're really looking for this portion of the pocket park is just your adoption of the concept itself. So at a future date, we could come back with an actual design documents to be able to build this, and that would come back to council.
Thanks, Robbie. Any questions, Robbie or Bill? Good.
The observation deck, I'm real concerned about the liabilities there. Personally, I've been involved in a fatality there. I've been involved in rescues off of that tower. So to eliminate any kind of potential of somebody crawling up that tower past that observation deck is a real concern I'd have.
Yeah, again, all that sort of stuff would have to be worked out when we got to that point, if we get to that point. And even if that doesn't happen, we still would have to ensure that people can't just climb the tower itself, as we're, incentivizing people to come here. So those are just things we'd have to work through when we get to that point.
Any questions, comments?
It's a cool idea.
Yeah. So what we need is an approval to bid on the parking lot and for an adoption of the conceptual plan for the park itself.
Correct.
Do you want two separate motions on that?
One is fine.
Trying to figure out a word, but one. I'd move to approve the, let's see this. I'd move to approve, to go to bid for the water tower parking lot and further approve the pocket park concept.
Second.
Motion second. Further discussion. Roll call, please.
Malloy,
Aye.
Ziegler,
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thanks. Robbie, Bill, thank you.
Sorry about the awkward wording on that. Hopefully it made sense.
And then we do have one ordinance tonight. Who's going to read that? Make the motion on that. I can do it, but I don't know if I can I?
Sure.
I move to place the ordinance vacating lift station easement on Lot 1, Block 4, Crimson King Estates on its first and only reading by title only while under suspension of the rules.
Second.
Motion seconds. Further discussion. Roll call, please.
Ziegler,
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Motion passes. Mr. Wilson.
An ordinance of the City of Post Falls, a municipal corporation of Idaho, providing for the vacation of a lift station easement on Lot 1, Block 4 of the Crimson King Estate subdivision recorded as instrument number 20560920000 on page 377A in Book J of Plats, Records of Kootenai County, Idaho, as described herein, providing for disposition of the vacated easement, providing repeal of conflicting ordinances, providing severability, providing for an effective date, and providing for other matters properly relating thereto.
I move to approve the ordinance vacating a lift station easement on Lot 1, Block 4, Crimson King Estates, and to direct the clerk to assign the appropriate number and that it be published by summary only.
Second.
Motion second. Discussion. Roll call, please.
Ziegler,
Aye.
Borders.
Aye.
Walker.
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thank you. Next up is new business, and it's Cornwell Rehabilitation Consulting Services. Brian.
Brian Myers, Parks Manager. Thanks for having me here tonight. I don't know if I'm batting cleanup or 9, but we're going to try to wrap this thing up rather quickly if we can. Mostly this is kind of a photo report of where we stand today down at Camelin. So kicking it off, this is a picture from just shortly after this well went into service for the City of Post Falls in the late 1970s. At that point in time, you can see the swim dock that used to be out in our swim area and such. So a number of you probably remember what the beach looked like at this time. I remember it as quite a log-ridden swim beach at that point, from the mill being across the street or across the river. So again, well was installed in 1975. It is a water system, public drinking water system that is managed by the City of Post Falls. the overall well and the site are managed by the Parks Department. The system is regulated by the Department of Environmental Quality as a public drinking water system. So under that, it falls under different requirements than it would a private well that provides water to an individual resident. That, with that, our system is the regular oversight is by our Public Works Division to provide a water operator that is familiar with the standards and such on a day-to-day basis, and to provide testing of the water quality at the site. As a part of that DEQ process and regulatory body, they come out and provide periodic inspections. They did one of those mid last summer, and in that finding that our well casing itself is beginning to rust. You can see that in this picture, and one of the requirements is that we provide solid well casing to prevent contaminants from entering the drinking water and or water in the aquifer itself. It's believed that this rust was found or had started to occur because of a covering that was placed over top of the wellhead that was unvented, so moisture and condensation forming on the portion of that well casing over time began to degrade the well casing itself. So this is primary problem number one at the site. Primary problem number two at the site is our actual pump house facility, where all of the components sit inside this well house. It's just adjacent to the Grand Pavilion. Foundation is beginning to crack, and with that, we're getting water seepage into the interiors, which could potentially impact the mechanics and the components within that well house. So those are the two significant deficiencies that were identified. Outside of that, there are some other rule requirement deficiencies that if we don't do too much work to this in fixing the first two significant deficiencies, we wouldn't be required to update these because we predated the installation of the well with the current requirement. So that will come at a later date, whether or not we have to also update these other items. So the other rule requirement is there's no operators and maintenance manual on file for the site because it predated those requirements. We didn't have an engineer design the facility that provided those documents to the city at that point in time. So next steps, and what's before you today, is a consultant services agreement with TO Engineers to evaluate the existing well, determine whether or not its condition warrants rehabilitation, and whether or not we pursue that course of action. If it can't be, evaluate the potential location for a new well and describe what that would be. That whole process has to be evaluated, and whichever course of action we determine will have to be reviewed by DEQ and their feedback, and it could send us on the course of drilling a new well. If we do determine that we could rehab it, we'll submit those plans and specs to DEQ. They'll review it, determine whether or not it meets their current standards. If yes, we'll go on with the construction project. If no, we go back to drilling another well. So that's our timeline, looking to complete by June 30th, 2025, one way or the other. So yeah, our request to approve the consulting services agreement with TO includes an evaluation of the existing well casing, which will be pulling the pump and motor, sending a camera down the well casing, having that reviewed by an individual capable of evaluating whether or not that can be repaired and how it would be repaired, and that a memo being drafted to take us to what our next course of action is. And at that point, I'll be back before you with a contract to draft construction drawings.
So are we just approving you, if approved, you're asking for approval to go out to TO Engineers to get a bid on this?
So this is to evaluate the existing well.
And
determine whether or not it can be rehabbed.
And so we would do that through TO Engineering?
Correct.
And I didn't see any costs up there.
$21,000, a little over $21,000.
Okay.
21,183.
Okay. I thought I saw it in the packet, but I just didn't see it on slides, so I wanted to make sure. Any questions?
And if
We
it's,
have to
if
do
it's
it.
a no on the rehab, it's a well site evaluation that will also occur. So it gets the first step of the evaluation process or the renewal process with DEQ,
Okay.
one way or the other.
Okay, Lynn, you had a comment?
I just say we have to do it. I mean, we've been put on notice by DEQ now, so we have to at least evaluate it and see where we're at and move forward, so. I'd move for approval of the Camila Well Rehabilitation Consulting Services with TO Engineers.
Second.
Motion second, further discussion. Roll call, please.
Ziegler,
Aye.
Orders,
Aye.
Walker,
Aye.
Malloy.
Aye.
Motion passes. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda tonight is citizens' issues, and this section of the agenda is reserved for citizens wishing to address the council regarding city-related issues that are not on the agenda. If anyone wishes to speak, come forward and give a name for the record. Mr. Burns.
Howard Burns, resident of Post Falls. You had a property workshop today. My comment
Hang,
to do with the property workshop?
hang on to your comments just till you get back, please. That way we can get you on recording.
Okay.
Is it for city clerk? Thank you.
So since the subject is on the top of your minds, my objection to the way property taxes are assessed is that there's a tremendous, and I know it's driven by the state, I know it's not something that you can theoretically accomplish on your own, but the ag and timber exemption is ridiculous. And I think that there's a tremendous disparity in values assessed adjacent property owners. And I've given exact examples with parcel numbers here in the correspondence I've just given you, or the research that I've done. And I believe that there is a way around it. And I am not an attorney, but I believe someone needs to take the bull by the horns and say, we're going to try it. And in my mind, the way to try that is to say, oh, you want to be annexed into the city? You want to get our sewer and our water? And you have to agree as a condition, you will no longer request a farm and ag or timber exemption, whatever it is. You will no longer, and you will actually affirmatively go and tell the assessor it is off our property. We don't have that exemption anymore. And if you want to rezone, to upzone your property, and you have currently are not developed and have a farm or timber exemption, the same thing should apply. No, you have to keep your current zoning, or you want to upzone, then you've got to remove your farm and timber exemption immediately. And just to give you an example, and it's in your packet, there's an 11-acre parcel which you've all put into the city. You annexed into the city a couple of years ago, an 11-acre parcel. Yeah, there's trees on it. It's actually two parcels, a 9.8 and about an acre parcel. That parcel sold first in 2016 for $1.2 million. It then was put under contract, I believe, subject to getting the permits and zoning that was finally approved here, and then it was resold for $3.9 million. And that property has been assessed or pays the taxes. It is example, I believe it's example 1, that the taxes last year on that parcel were $235. And that's not fair to anybody. And while there's other things could be reassessed, that simple move, assuming you can figure out a way that it's legal. It's a condition. Don't come into the city then. Don't be part of it. Take off the ag and timber exemption. And there's huge chunks of property that are in that transitional zone that have that exemption. And I think there's a way to address them paying their fair share. And I know they would argue, well, it's not a fair share because we haven't done anything with the land. Well, there's lots of other vacant land in this city where people pay a much higher vacant land tax. So that's what I'd like you to think about. I've tried to give you the ammunition to consider it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Administrative staff reports.
We have none tonight, sir.
Mayor and council comments. I don't have any. Council?
I don't have any.
Nope. Perfect. Do we need an executive session?
We do not.
So the next motion is,
Adjourn.
all those in favor?
Aye.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you all.